I want to welcome everybody this evening to what I know will be an excellent program, because I know Rabbi Nina from rabbinical school days just a few years ago, and where we overlapped. She was ordained the year before I was, she very excited that she's practically a neighbor living in the Baltimore area, and already made a Jewish geography connection with Joyce Feinstein, who's from Baltimore, and they're practically mishpacha. So that's the beauty of these programs, that you never know who you're going to meet and who you have a connection with. So it's wonderful to welcome Rabbi Nina Beth Cardin here, and this is a part of our Social Action Committee work this year, where we're kind of branching out in different directions. We heard last month about our work with welcoming and facilitating Afghan refugees into the area. And now Lori Dubrow is heading up our climate change work as well. So let me turn it over to Lori, who will introduce Rabbi Nina.
Thank you, Rabbi. And there's so much I could say. I'll be succinct so we have our precious time with Rabbi Nina. But Rabbi Nina works as a community rabbi with a focus on environmental sustainability. She's the founder and director of the Maryland Campaign for Environmental Human Rights, an initiative that is working toward a state constitutional provision that would protect all of Marylanders' rights to a healthful environment. She has also served as the director of the National Coalition on Environment and Jewish Life, founded and directed the Baltimore Orchard Project, served as chair of the Interfaith Partners for the Chesapeake, and served as the sustainability consultant for the Central Maryland Ecumenical Council. Rabbi Nina was part of the first class of women to be ordained by the Jewish Theological Seminary in 1988. She has served JTS in several capacities, including as assistant dean of the rabbinical school. She's the co-author of the conservative movement's Responsum on Sustainability and the co-chair of the Masorti Conservative Movement's Sustainability Roundtable. Rabbi Nina will share about her personal journey as a rabbi who has embraced environmental action as central to her community pulpit, and educate us on her efforts concerning the Environmental Human Rights Amendment.
Before, just to interrupt a moment, just with logistics, everybody is muted, and I encourage people to please stay muted. And if you have questions over the course of the presentation, please use the chat function. I hope everybody by now, 3 years into COVID and Zoom, that people are familiar with the chat function. Just send the question to, make sure the question is going to everyone as opposed to one specific person in the chat, and that way I'll be able to see the questions as Rabbi Nina is presenting and interrupt or save them until the end.
Great.
Rabbi Nina.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to sort of have a reunion with Rabbi Lehman. We haven't seen each other in a while, but somehow the seminary days just seemed like a couple years ago, just what happens to time. And Laurie, thank you so much for inviting me here and for that lovely introduction. So briefly about my rabbinic journey. I was in my early 30s when the Jewish Theological Seminary opened its doors to women. I had sort of been, chomping at the bit before then. So I would say the early part of my life, my activism really focused on feminism and egalitarianism. I founded the Jewish Women's Resource Center. I call myself a serial founder of things, it's kind of like professional ADD. I keep founding organizations to respond to issues of the day. So for the first part of my life, it was really about feminism and egalitarianism. And I was grateful for the seminary when they opened up their doors to women in 84. And as you heard, I was ordained in 88. And so throughout that time, I was working on issues of egalitarianism. And it wasn't just enough that women should be admitted to the rabbinical school. It's that women should be considered of equal value. Paula Hyman, who was a professor of history at the Jewish Theological Seminary when I was there, and then she went to Yale and unfortunately passed away way too early, said that equality is not just about equal access, but it's about equal value. And when women were first admitted to rabbinical school, it was really about equal access. And believe me, I was grateful for the equal access. So whatever restrictions the rabbinical school wanted to put on, women as, rabbinical students, I was willing to accept because I wanted in. But once you got in and once other women got in, all of a sudden we realized, well, we wanted to be valued equally as the men. So we were then working on aspects of equal value. So that was sort of the way that my early rabbinate, began with that as the focus of my work. And then I was ordained in 88. I was ordained in May. I think it was like May 22nd or so. I think I remember that because a week later I gave birth to my fourth child, which means that I was 9 months pregnant when I was ordained. And I kind of loved that because it kind of reminded the professors and the administration and the rabbinical assembly that when you admit women to the rabbinate, we're not going to be exactly the same as the men, as I'm waddling down, the aisle, 9 months pregnant. So what's fascinating, though, is that my first job as a rabbi was at the Jewish Theological Seminary. I was the assistant to essentially the COO to Rabbi Michael Greenbaum, who was a wonderful mentor. And I must tell you, he interviewed me for the job when I was 7 months pregnant, and this is back in the 80s, remember? I mean, as enlightened as we weren't, not everybody was all that enlightened. So for somebody to interview somebody who's 7 months pregnant with their fourth child, and to say, I can trust her, with this job, I thought was really quite commendable. So anyway, so he hired me and I was his assistant. And he was, let's say, the COO. So he just took care of the management, of the seminary, the building, right? Just the operations of the seminary. And one of the tasks that he gave to me, put in my portfolio, was to oversee the cafeteria. I waited this long to go to rabbinic school. I put 4 years in rabbinic, and I'm now overseeing and supervising the cafeteria, really? But actually, I think that in part got me started on the professional engagement with sustainability, because one of the things we had to talk about was disposables or reusables, right? What's more environmentally healthy and sustainable? What does it cost us to wash and manage and handle things that are reusable, like dishes? And if we have, what kind of dishes would be good? What is the healthiest way to do all that, as opposed to disposables? And if you have disposables, well, do you have paper disposables? Do you have styrofoam disposables? And I got to tell you, I learned a lot more about styrofoam than I ever wanted, to learn. And then about waste management, and what do you do with your food after? It's all in the trash, right? I mean, all these things that now we know so much more about, dividing the sort of compostables from the non-compostables, hopefully the recyclables from non-recyclables, all the rest. And what do you buy? What are the cost factors in what do you buy? So that was me, first year as an ordained rabbi, worrying about the sustainability management and environmental impact of our cafeteria. And I didn't realize it at the time. I mean, I was sort of, I was not annoyed, but I was kind of amused that that's what I was doing in service to the seminary. But I didn't realize at the time that it was really part of my rabbinate, that sustainability has to be part of who we are in caring for this earth. And if we don't care for the earth, we can't care for each other. Liberty Hyde Bailey, who was an an agricultural professor back in the early 1900s, has this wonderful quote, which for some reason I can never fully remember appropriately, but he says something like, you can't truly care for your fellow if you can't truly care for the earth. Right. And I'll be going into that. I do have a PowerPoint about the work that I'm doing now. So in fact, as I look back sort of fondly on those years of wondering about the cafeteria, I see that was really part of my environmental rabbinate, was trying to figure out, how do we live on this earth in a way that protects and sustains the earth while we protect and, sustain our fellow humans and other than human life. So that's sort of my quick roundup about the rabbinate. And then after I left the seminary and I came to Baltimore to serve as the Jewish educator at the JCC of Baltimore, one of my pet projects was trying to get the JCCs to recycle and understand, what about water usage? Because JCCs are, water hogs, right? How do we manage our water? How do we manage our energy? Because we also have to heat a lot of water. So it was also, oh my gosh, here we are again, coming as a Jewish educator, and I'm worried about the physical plant and operations management, because of course that affects the quality of life that we all live. So I couldn't get away from it. So after 6 years of the JCC, and much as I love Baltimore, I love the people at the JCC of Baltimore, and I love the JCC, I was frustrated that I could not move the JCC and move the Jewish community fast enough toward sustainability practices as I wanted. And as any good Jewish child, I thought, oh God, it's because I'm not good enough at doing this, right? It's my fault. I should just be able to do this better. So I actually quit the JCC and I went to study a little bit about sustainability. And what I didn't know at the time, there's this whole field of sustainability communications, right? I mean, it wasn't just my inability to message things properly. It's a whole field that's been around for 10, 15 years or so, trying to understand, how do we get people to embrace messages of sustainability? So I studied that, and then that launched me into this whole rabbinate of sustainability that I'm in right now. And it's that I would love to talk with you about, because let me just clear my throat. Hang on a sec. Because as Laurie said, I did found an organization called the Maryland Campaign for Environmental Human Rights. Because when I first began entering the field of environmentalism and environmental activism here in Maryland about 15 years ago, I heard two complaints mainly. One, we don't have the proper legal tools to get the work done that we need to get done in the amount of time that we need to get it done. And we need better legal tools. And back then, the other cry was, we're not engaging a sufficiently sort of expansive community in the work. That is, those people who are in what they call the front lines or the fence lines, those people who are most disproportionately harmed by the environmental degradation that we are creating. We're not sitting in the board meetings or around the table of those organizations that were working toward environmental sustainability. There was a class and a color divide. So I began to look around to see what answers might respond to both of those concerns, creating a more embracing environmental movement and provide greater legal protection for all of us, for the environment and for the individuals. And I bumped into this idea of constitutional environmental rights. I actually saw it first in Canada. David Suzuki Foundation in Canada is trying to get environmental rights put in their federal constitution. And he's been having trouble too. So I thought, oh my gosh, what a great idea, in my naivete, never having undertaken a political campaign before. Who can fight against, who can be against inserting environmental rights in our Constitution, in our Declaration of Rights of our Constitution, which is our Bill of Rights in the state of Maryland. That's a great idea. I'll do that for a couple of years and then I'll move on to something else, you know? So that was 7 years ago. What I found out was, and it wasn't just David Suzuki who was looking at putting environmental rights as a fundamental human right in the Canadian Constitution, but that in 1973, or early 1970s, I should say, in the early 1970s, 5 United States put environmental rights in their constitutions. That was, you remember, in the early 1970s, that was the heyday of environmental activism, with Earth Day and with EPA being created and the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, and everybody seeing environmental protection as a human, nonpartisan response. It wasn't even that it was bipartisan, it was just a nonpartisan, everybody's concerned about the environment and we all have to take care of the environment. Well, that was the era of 1970s. Since the 1970s, there was one state in the 1980s that then also put environmental rights in their constitution. That was Rhode Island. And then since the 1980s until 2021, so for 20 years, there was not a single state that put environmental rights in their constitution. In 2021, New York State put environmental rights in their constitution. But in the meantime, over the last 5 years, since I've been doing this, about 14 states have been looking at putting what I call environmental human rights in their constitution. And no one but New York has been able to succeed at that. And when I asked folks in New York, how did you get it done? It was basically all political. It was the leadership of the General Assembly of the state of New York wanted to make sure that it had progressives coming out to the polls to make sure that the Democrats kept their majority. You know, so I spoke to one person who was I was told to speak to because she was evidently critical for getting the votes in the General Assembly, and I contacted her office and a staffer got back to me and said, yeah, well, the assemblywoman doesn't want to talk to you because she doesn't really know anything about the bill. She was just told to get it passed, you know. So that didn't help us any in the response to challenges that we met in trying to get environmental human rights amendment in our Constitution. And for 5 years now, we have proposed every General Assembly for the past 5 years a bill that would put environmental rights in our state constitution. And it has not gone out of committee in any of those years, including this year, when crossover day was yesterday. Crossover day is the day of the General Assembly, when a bill essentially has to clear one house before it can go to the other house. And if it doesn't clear one house, it doesn't pass in one house, the Senate or the House, then it's dead for the year. So yesterday was crossover day. We didn't get out of committee. So we're dead again this year. So I'll talk a little bit about that when I have the PowerPoint. But that idea, that's what sort of launched me in this sort of the activism of this, of working with the legislature. And I don't know how many of you know, the legislature of Maryland is only a 90-day legislature. It only works for 90 days, has a 90-day session. So it's very hard to get bills through because they're so pressed for time. They get several thousand bills that are submitted to them, and only several hundred pass. And so it's really very competitive. Even good bills often don't pass just because they don't have the time. And I like to think that ours is a good bill that just didn't pass. But that hasn't stopped the general work. And I still very much believe, as you'll see in a moment when I show you the PowerPoint, that promoting environmental human rights is the way to go. And that will provide us with the legal tools that we need, and it will speak to and engage those communities that most need a voice at the table to protect the environment for them. So that's my quick background. And I do this, by the way, not aside from being a rabbi, but I do it because, in part, I'm a rabbi. And I have to tell you, the faith community has been incredibly supportive. I would say there are two constituencies that are the most supportive of this: the faith community, and I don't think you'll be surprised, the youth. the youth are really excited about this. So anyway, all right, so let me see, I should be able to share screen as you say, Rabbi. We've been doing this for 3 years now. I think I should be able to do this. Let me see. Yeah, let me just get this more centered in my screen. Okay, you can all see this? Yep, okay, super. So this down here, I'll probably coming back to this, but since I'm talking to a nice Jewish group, I figured I would throw this in. I don't always speak in the language of faith when I speak to non-faith communities. But Isaiah has this wonderful pasuk, this wonderful verse. He says, God fashioned and created the earth. God founded it. God did not create it to be empty, but formed it to be inhabited. Lashevet Yetzirah is what the Hebrew is. Lashevet, that's sort of like to be inhabited. Yetzirah, God created it. And it is this verse that the tshuva, the paper that Laurie mentioned that I co-wrote with my husband on sustainability for the conservative movement. It's this verse that the paper turns on, that from this verse, tradition created a mitzvah, and we call it like the mitzvah that's like the most foundational mitzvah that nobody knows. And the mitzvah is called Yishuv HaOlam, to establish a habitable world. And that mitzvah runs through rabbinic texts for several thousands of years or so, and nobody really knows about it. But because we never needed it, it's like you elevate those things that you need. But based on this verse, the rabbis came up with this understanding that prior to all other mitzvot is the foundational mitzvah of establishing a habitable world. And so for us, it's a whole other conversation we can have about Yishuv HaOlam and how that was developed in Jewish tradition. But that's what Judaism has to say. And for us, I just thought I wanted to point that out to you. And that's the verse that the mitzvah turns on. All right, but let me go now to the slideshow so you don't see everything right there. But I'll sort of miss. Where do we start from the start? I'll miss seeing most of you this way. Oh, I guess I can still see you. Okay. All right. So here, I do have to condense you so that I can see this. I have put this in here because just this week, right, just a couple of days ago, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, wrote its most urgent, pressing report, which is that we are running out of time. I mean, they did not mince words in this report. They said we have until 2030 to make sure that we do not exceed 1.5 degrees centigrade increase in temperature. Otherwise, all bets are off. They cannot predict the consequences of that, but they will not be good. And this is just one quote that I pulled from that. It's not just the way we produce and use energy. It's the way we consume food. It's the way we protect nature. It's kind of like everything, everywhere, all at once, right? This is so dire that we need to be consumed, in a sense, by our mandate to do everything we can to limit climate change and to limit the use of fossil fuels and other aspects of our society that put greenhouse gases into the air. We're not fooling around. And so, 10 easy steps to do this. We're way beyond 10 easy steps, right? We have just got to get in there full force and do everything that we can to make sure that we protect this world for not even future generations, but for ourselves as well as our children and grandchildren. The United Nations about 10 years ago created what they call a special rapporteur on human rights and the environment. That's like the highest level of concern that the United Nations can sort of demonstrate with, by saying, I'm going to appoint a special rapporteur to look at this issue. That's when you know they're really, really serious about it. So they did that, I think it was 2012, if I'm not mistaken. And they say that environmental health is a fundamental human right. The General Assembly passed that statement that environmental health is a fundamental human right just this past summer. And they declare that a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is integral to the full enjoyment of a wide range of human rights. Without a healthy environment, we are unable to fulfill our aspirations. We might not have access to even the minimum standards of human dignity. And human dignity is the bedrock upon which all civilization stands. So they're saying that environmental health is a fundamental human right. David Suzuki didn't say it first. We are not outliers here in Maryland saying that we want to put it in our Constitution. The United Nations General Assembly as a whole just established that, in fact, environmental health is a fundamental right. And while this statement, their resolution, is not legally binding on anyone, it is a moral statement providing sort of a sense of moral obligation so that states around the world will now implement that, which is why when we saw this happening, we thought, wow, maybe this will be the year that the General Assembly of Maryland will finally recognize that we have to put in our Constitution this fundamental right, which will establish that right for everything that we do and guide everything we do that affects the environment here in Maryland. We were not so lucky this year, but we are in good company nonetheless for the United Nations General Assembly. Oh, by the way, I should say it passed, that resolution passed 161 to nothing. Nobody voted against it. There were, I can't remember now, 6 or 8, I think there were 6 countries that abstained, Syria, China, and Russia among them. But even they didn't have the courage to vote against it, right? Nobody voted against it. So I would have thought that we would have been able to get this passed in Maryland, but we weren't. So what are some of the moral elements of environmental human rights? Why do I focus so much on environmental human rights and have this drumbeat and spend all this time not actually succeeding legally? Because it's important that we all understand we all have this fundamental right. Caring for creation, as I mentioned before, Yishuv HaOlam is fundamental to Judaism. Sefer HaChinuch, like a 13th century treatment of all the 613, mitzvot, put Yishuv HaOlam first. Samson Raphael Hirsch, 19th century, German rabbi, says Yishuv HaOlam, the Bal Tashlit, do not destroy anything, foundational mitzvah upon which the world rests, all of the other mitzvah rest on, Bal Tashlit, don't destroy Yishuv HaOlam are sort of conflated. So Judaism believes that is the fundamental value that we all have to live by. If you don't have a healthy environment, you don't have human dignity, you don't have human opportunity and hope and opportunity for the future, then then the game's over. So we have that. And there are 2 other elements: environmental justice, which is otherwise known as intragenerational equity. Nobody in any generation should be oppressed more by environmental degradation than others. And what we know now is that those people who are poor and of color are disproportionately affected by environmental degradation because there are these things called sacrifice zones. We put the highways and the incinerators and the landfills and industrial polluting sources in a cluster together. And then people like, mostly, I guess, you and me, live in these beautiful, bucolic communities. So somebody is taking on the brunt of the waste that we put out there. And environmental justice says that is just unfair. One, nobody should be disproportionately impacted by environmental degradation, but I would like to go further and say we should now, knowing what we know, build a society that does not have environmental degradation at all. We have to wean ourselves away from the processes that have created the problem in the first place. And then there is intergenerational equity, which is sort of an evolving idea, which is that from Judaism, it's midor lador. We've known this forever, but somehow the world is now beginning to recognize it. So sorry about my throat. I'm not quite sure what's happening. But at any rate, intergenerational equity says that we, current generation, have an obligation to protect this world for future generations, just as generations that came before us had an obligation to protect the world for us. And as we were given all of these opportunities, so we have to pass on all these opportunities of a healthy world to future generations. And the reason that this is so important, the reason this is so important is because future generations don't have a seat at the table, either because they're too young or because they don't yet exist. And so we have a very short time frame view of things. And politics, as you know, has a very short term, time frame view, and business is a very short term, time frame view. And we don't have to answer. We don't have to look anybody in the eye and say, oh, we're destroying the environment. And you're going to have less opportunity because we're going to be using up all of these natural resources and putting all this waste back in. We don't have to explain it to them because they're not here. So intergenerational equity says, no, we have to understand that we have this obligation to them. And there is an idea, in fact, which I'm hoping to talk to you a little bit about later if we have time, about creating what's called either an ombudsperson for future generations or a guardian for future generations. This has been, Israel, in fact, had one, Wales has one, Hungary had one, where in fact there was a governmental person whose seat and portfolio was to be that voice of future generations in contemporary decision making. So these are the moral elements of environmental human rights, and why I think it's really so critical that we remind ourselves that we have this imperative and it is up to us to pursue that. And in case morals don't persuade people, maybe the economy would. And Herman Daly, who just passed away this past year, I don't know if any of you recognize his name. He was an economist at University of Maryland, as a matter of fact, wrapped up like sort of a life work when this one sentence: the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment, not the reverse. You cannot have a healthy economy if you don't have a healthy environment. You can't have healthy workforce if you don't have a healthy environment. You can't have good resources if you don't have a healthy environment. I mean, as he was saying, you can have a 30-mile long net to capture all the fish that you want in the sea. But if there are no fish in the sea, it doesn't make a difference how long your net is, right? I mean, the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment. So we have to make sure we take care of the environment so that we can take care of the economy. So why legal protection for environmental human rights? Why put it in some sort of legal framework, not just in a moral framework? Because morals don't, you can't take morals to court, right? You can't enforce them. And Cormac Cullinan has this, I think, wonderful statement which helps us understand why we need to put this in our laws. Any given legal order is constrained by its tacit frame of reference, by the deep structure of the prevailing social values. Our contemporary social values are that property rights are supreme, right? Are that property and the environment, that the environment is property, that businesses must have as much free reign as possible. And so we have this deep structure about protecting our property at all costs, that we should not pursue takings that is preventing people from enjoying the full value that they can sort of wrest from their property and their ownership. But rather, we should just let, people do what they want, more or less, to the property, except in certain circumstances where we might want to constrain them because we think that something important has to be protected. Well, what Cullinan is teaching us is that we have to put in the deep structure of our prevailing social values and put them in law, the fact that we have to first and foremost protect the environment for ourselves and future generations. How we do that is what lots of smart people are thinking about. I'm not a particularist. I don't work in the granular area of this, but these are questions that are being asked and answered by very smart people. We can figure out how to do that without so totally constraining us that we're all sort of, hogtied and we can't move, and businesses can't progress and development will stop. Just that won't happen. But we have to reimagine our fundamental values, and protecting the environment has to be a fundamental value, and it has to inform our laws, which means that if we had this fundamental right to a healthful environment, that right would undergird all legislation and policies affecting the environment and public health, which is what we need. Because right now it's sort of an afterthought or an add-on. And as I mentioned, the United Nations passed a resolution on environmental health this past summer, and 7 states now have constitutional environmental rights. And depending on the counts, and I see counts all over the place, 70, 80, 90, over 100 countries have in their constitution something about environmental rights. The United States does not. We're not going to get it in the federal constitution for a while, so at least we should promote it in local state constitutions. So I wanted to give you real quickly, I don't have a clock available to me. What time is it?
7:37.
Okay, I'm going to try to go quickly. So I want to give you 3 examples of why we need legal protection for environmental rights. This is just one quick example. You can read about in the Chesapeake Legal Alliance, CLA, Chesapeake Legal Alliance, over this past year or so has finally stepped in to help this poor community. This is Lothian in Anne Arundel County. As you can see, it's a residential community. It has been inundated with industrial pollution sources for over 30 years. 30 years ago, there was a permit which gave these quarries an exception about what they could do. In the meantime, they have violated that permit, violated the exemptions that they were given. They've exceeded even those, and you can see they've got direct releases of pollution to the air and the water, excessive and heavy traffic and extreme noise, which they were promised would never happen. They've been in violation. The companies have been in violation of their permit, and and it is a historically Black community, in case you wondered how they could get away with this. And they've been fighting this for 30 years. Finally, Chesapeake Legal Alliance got involved and has now given them some of the relief that they've been seeking, so that now the powers that be that oversee this are, in fact, holding those local companies responsible for ceasing the activities that are inappropriate for them. But if we had an environmental human rights amendment, the Lothian community could have sued. They could have sued the state for not enforcing the laws that are on the books that would have protected them, because there are laws in the books that have protected them, but they weren't being implemented. Even to the extent that they weren't being implemented, never mind making the laws stronger so they could be protect this community some more. If there had been an environmental human rights amendment, they would have been able to sue. They haven't been able to sue, but Chesapeake Legal Alliance was able to do other actions in other ways to give them some sort of relief. Talking about environmental injustice, I hope you can all see this. This is as you can see, it's about like a mortality, chart. There's in the yellow, the life expectancy is 66 years. In the red, 85 years. I don't know how many of you know Baltimore. This is, of course, the city of Baltimore. 20-year difference in life expectancy in these two areas. And you will not be surprised to know that these are largely, the yellow, largely African-American communities of color, communities that live in areas that do not have sufficient parks, tree cover, that have clustered sources of pollution. So there's all this environmental injustice there, and places like Roland Park, which is, is green, it's bucolic, trash is taken care of easily. So it's just the environmental injustice yielding 20-year difference in life expectancy, just unacceptable. And here is a heat map. And again, you can see in this area, again, the Roland Park area, where it's nice and white, and I don't know how many of you know, it was obvious it was a place where Jews were actually banned from living, for many years, and like in the early mid 20th century, it was a place where the well-heeled would go, as opposed to here in East Baltimore and elsewhere downtown, which is a hard surface, but also it's more where you would find in Pigtown area here, communities of color clustered. And the greatest contributor, the greatest weather and climate change contributor to early mortality is heat. It's not the storms, it's not the flooding, it is the heat. And so in some of these communities where people not only have heat, but don't have resources for air conditioning and relief from the heat, there's a higher mortality. And that's just environmental injustice right there, which is why we need to have a legal resource to fight for environmental justice. Hub Hopkins, who works for Sierra Club, and he's their sort of environmentally just, I don't know exactly his title, but he's got the portfolio for environmental justice, wrote, "You can't have climate change without sacrifice zones. You can't have sacrifice zones without disposable people. And you can't have disposable people without racism." And our laws and our regulations don't fully take into consideration things like cumulative impacts when offering permits to polluting sources, or where they might put highways, where they might put incinerators and all. So we need something that's going to protect the most vulnerable people in a wholesale level. An environmental human rights amendment would do that. But we don't have an environmental human rights amendment yet. And yet, in some respect, we kind of do, because in 1973, again, that heyday of environmental activism, the state of Maryland passed something called the Environmental Policy Act. And the Environmental Policy Act said this, and this is a quote: "Each person has a fundamental and inalienable right to a healthful environment." In 1973, the General Assembly of the state of Maryland proclaimed that each person has a fundamental and inalienable right to a healthful environment, which are the words that we picked up from this Maryland Environmental Policy Act and put into our bill. We wanted those words to be in our state constitution, in our Declaration of Rights. Didn't happen. But we were saying, we're not making this up. Maryland established this 50 years ago. This is the 50th, literally, this year is the 50th anniversary of MEPA. Maryland established that everyone has a fundamental and inalienable right to a healthful environment 50 years ago. And it hasn't lived up to that. It says down here, "All state agencies shall identify, develop, and adopt methods and procedures that will ensure the implementation of these policies," the implementation of this right. Didn't happen. It's like the most people don't even know MEPA exists. It just never happened. But in 1978, with the Maryland Environmental Standing Act, those words were sort of repeated. The General Assembly finds that the improper use and exploitation of the physical environment constitute an invasion of the right of every resident of Maryland to an environment free from pollution to the extent possible. Not as broad as environmental human rights, but it says here we still have a right to a healthy environment, right? As much as it's possible. This right was never taken seriously, never implemented, and never taken seriously. So what the Maryland Campaign for Environmental Human Rights was dedicated to was promoting environmental human rights, either by putting that in the state constitution or by making sure that the government implemented the Maryland Environmental Policy Act, which codifies that right. So what we're doing today is, let me just say this one last thing, and then I'll say what we're doing today in a moment. Hans Jonas, I don't know if any of you have heard the name Hans Jonas. Hans Jonas was actually a Jewish philosopher, born, I believe it was in Germany, left before World War II, went and lived in Israel, in fact, fought in the War of Independence, and then left there, ended up in the United States. And he was very concerned about the abuse of technology. And I think all in part because of who he was, where he was, and what he saw the Nazis do with technology. And at the same time, he understood that technology was destroying the environment. And he wrote this book, The Imperative of Responsibility, which in parts of it are just have soaring language and so compelling, and parts of it are dated. But he has this one line, which I think is critical. He says, "We must act so the effects of our actions are compatible with the permanence of life." If there's a bumper sticker that should just guide us in everything that we do, it's this: we must act so that the effects of all of our actions are compatible with the permanence of life. Everything we do, before we do it, we should say, is this, ask ourselves a simple question. Do I think this is compatible with the permanence of life? And if it is, then it's a good thing to do and it's a good policy. And if it's not, I have to figure out how to not do this. And I've got to figure out how to get the system not to do this anymore either. So anyway, what are we doing now? We still believe that environmental human rights are the key to making sure that we protect the environment for us and future generations in an equitable fashion, intragenerational equity and intergenerational equity. We are not currently suggesting that we go back and ask for an environmental human rights amendment this coming year. The obstacles that we've been facing the past 5 years are still there. There's no reason to beat our head against the wall. We have to wait until there's an opportunity and there's an opening to promote environmental human rights for our Constitution. I don't know exactly when or how that will be. I believe it will absolutely be there. There are many, many young people who are so eager for this that even if I'm not there to lead the charge, I think they will be there. But what we can do is write to Governor Moore, because MEPA is still on the books. Maryland Environmental Policy Act, which says we all have this fundamental right, is still the law of the land. And all it takes is Governor Moore to say, agencies, I want you to write those methods and procedures that implement that right to a healthful environment, that implement everyone's right to a healthful environment. So right now, what we're saying is if you go to, I did not put my, yeah, I did, mdehr.org, right? If you go to mdehr.org, on that homepage, you will find a click and you can just send a letter with one click to Governor Moore saying implement MEPA. And that's what we can do now. I'm also beginning to put together a conversation about intergenerational equity. That is potentially understanding how we can put in our government a position that says that holds the portfolio of speaking on behalf of future generations. If you're interested, please let me know. We have a wonderful speaker, Sunday, April 23rd. She was a minister in Wales who created the position of ombudsperson for future generations in Wales, which is still going on and is a great support for their efforts for environmental health. And you can learn more about environmental human rights simply by Googling Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment. And the UN that'll take you to the UN page that will take you there. So I am going to stop sharing now. So that's my story. That's what we're doing now.
Well, this is fantastic. Thank you for this this great presentation, Rabbi Nina. And had you not had that last slide, that would have been my question to you. What can we do to get involved? So I'll be sure to send out that link to the website to encourage people to sign on to write that letter to Governor Moore.
That'd be great.
So I want to encourage people to go into the chat if you have a question for Rabbi Nina. We have, I just want to be conscious of time. We have about 10 minutes till we wrap up. So,
You don't want to type it?
yeah, Saul.
Yeah, who supports you financially? Is it the Chesapeake Legal Organization?
So the Chesapeake Legal Alliance has supported us not financially, but with amazing advisors. We have gotten, I haven't totaled it up, literally tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars of support with the volunteer lawyers that they've given to us, helping us do research on the language of environmental human rights amendments, constructing white papers on why this is important. So they've been very helpful in-kind gifts. We really run on a shoestring budget. There are a couple of foundations that have given us small grants, $5,000, $10,000, $20,000 grants. But that's really all that we have. So we're really a David, up against a bigger Goliath, but I thank you for that question. Do you have ideas behind that question?
I muted you, Saul. So.
It could be if there's somebody supporting you and we agree with you, then we might want to give to that organization.
Right. I'll be very honest. I don't know what the future of Maryland Campaign for Environmental Human Rights will be this coming year. I'm going to be stepping back somewhat. I will still be involved in discussions and organizing, but I'm not going to be leading it this coming year. And our communications person is also, I think, burnt out after all this time. So we're looking for new leadership. If you're interested in joining the organization and potentially helping us identify new leadership, and that would be great. We'll be sending out information about a conversation we're going to have in June. It'll sort of be a town hall meeting about how do we move this initiative forward, with or without the organization behind it, but how do we move the initiative forward? So if you're interested, let me know.
Yeah,
Yes,
Lori.
Laurie,
Yeah, how do we get on your mailing list? Is there a simple way to do that?
there is. Let me quickly put that in the chat. Here you go. I'll get back to you. Just click on that. And that will take you to a page where you can simply put in your email address and you'll be on our mailing list.
Great.
So yes, and Rabbi Lehman, if you could send that out to folks so they could have that too, that would be great.
Definitely. Mhm.
So what are people thinking? You don't have to ask me a question. Let me hear from you. Just what are your responses? Does this move you? Does this miss the mark? Do you know, how does this engage you? Does it engage you? Yes, Mary. Is that Mary? Oh, you're muted.
I'm Tina.
Yeah, okay.
The way it hits me is that a little bit of hopelessness of, what can little me do here that isn't just a drop in the bucket. You've worked for so many years trying to even just get it into the Maryland legislature to pass something, and you're so savvy about all this stuff, and you haven't succeeded. So yeah, it's a little hard the place where I'm sitting.
I hear you. And there's some days where it's hard to get up and keep going. But I will say this. First, we all know that if we don't try, it'll never work, right? It'll only work if we try. Two, when I work with the youth, there were some studies done about the responsive youth to the situation, the climate situation, environmental situation, and their attitude toward adults. They are not just in despair and not just anxious and concerned. They feel betrayed. And not just by the adults, they feel betrayed by their legislators. They feel betrayed by their government. That's who they call out. And by the way, I mentioned this in my testimony this year. I mentioned this to the legislators. It did not get the response that I was hoping for. But I'll be damned if I'm going to be part of that community of adults that betrays our youth. And they feel hope because there are people like you and me out there fighting with them. And I believe we're blazing a path that they now say, I can go there, right? I can go there. And I'm hopeful that there will be a difference. And you know what Margaret Mead said, right? Never underestimate the ability of a small group of people to change the world. They're the only ones that have. So if you simply talk to people, just spread the word. Do you know something? We are endowed with an environmental human right. Not only that, our state laws have said for 50 years, we have an environmental human right. We have to hold our legislators to that truth. And over time, it will change. It'll become part of what I showed you that first slide. It'll become part of the deep structure of the cultural values. And once it's part of the deep structure of the cultural values that guide us, it will then be able to be put into our law to be implemented and enforced. So, yep, it's easy to give up, but we can't afford to do that. And every time a young person will hear you speak this way, you will give them hope. So it looks like you might have a young person sitting next to you. I don't know how old they are, but.
All right, so I see Patricia Green has her hand up. Maybe this will be the last question or comment.
Okay.
I also think on a very micro level, what are we doing individually? You know, how many bags are we using? How are we recycling? I mean, I just moved to an apartment and I realized I can compost in my apartment. I mean, so all the things we realize, so yes, it's getting out to the legislature, but, you know, I go out to the recycling room and I just see, you know, tons of plastic bottles. And I just think, are you kidding me? You know, so I think we also have to take it on a very personal level. You know, I learned from my children what I should be doing, just looking around, what can I do to make I do everything I can to try to make my carbon footprint as small as possible.
Yeah, we got there by the aggregation of all our actions, and we can hopefully get out of it with the aggregation of all our good actions, although we also need to change policy. So we need to act on both scores. And I know that you are involved in the Adama Jewish Climate Leadership Coalition, which is great. That's getting the congregation as a whole involved in climate change actions. So you're setting a standard for other members of your congregation, which is really terrific. So all of those things, personal action, communal action, and legislative, political action. We need all of those. We can't all do all of them, but a congregation can do all of them, and different people can focus on different aspects. So it's 7:58, and I know, Rabbi Lehman, we have to end.
No, this is fantastic. You know, often when we have presentations like this, we feel overwhelmed that this is just another one in a long series of social justice issues that need attention. And but you know, it is also inspiring. It's invigorating to hear this, and one person at a time, like you're saying, we can make a difference. And we look forward to being in touch to see how we can move the agenda forward and how we can partner with you and with the organization in the future. And we just want to thank Rabbi Nina for her time this evening, for a fantastic presentation, and wish everybody a good night.
And thank you,
Chag
Lori.
Sameach, Chag Sameach, everybody.
Thanks, Lori, for getting this going.
Yes.
Thank you so much,
Laurie.
Laurie. Thank you all. It's a pleasure.
my
Take
pleasure.
care.